Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Medisodes. This week, we're going to be focusing on the heart's rhythm, specifically on arrhythmias. Before we get into arrhythmias themselves, I'll first go through how the heart muscle keeps rhythm in a healthy patient. The human heart beats over 2 billion times in the average human's lifespan. It is the cardiac conduction system that regulates this. The cardiac conduction system conducts of four distinct parts: sinoatrial node, atrioventricular node, bundle of His, and the ventricular myocytes. These four parts sum up the stages in which the electrical impulses are conducted throughout the heart. Initially, the electrical signal is generated in the sinoatrial node, the wall of the right atrium. The signal propagates through the cells in both atria, stimulating muscle contraction and thus pumping blood into the ipsilateral ventricles. The electrical impulses from both atria then travel down and meet at the atrioventricular node, which is found within the septum between the left and right side of the heart. Here it is delayed for approximately 120 milliseconds before passing to the bundle of His just below, which is a group of specialized heart cells adapted for electrical conduction. The impulse finally travels to the Purkinje fibers, which propagate the impulse to ventricular myocytes that contract to pump blood out of the heart. This process is heavily controlled and requires precision in order to maintain the efficiency that the heart pumps with today. For example, the delay of 120 milliseconds at the AV node might not seem like much, but is in fact crucial in ensuring that the blood from the atria is completely emptied into the ventricles before the ventricles contract. It would be inefficient if the ventricles contracted at the same time as the atria. It would be pumping less blood out of the heart. The cardiac cycle matches exactly with the path of cardiac conduction that I've just outlined. Where does this electrical impulse come from? I've mentioned that the origin is a group of specialized cells in the right atrial wall, but how do they generate this impulse? Similar to a nervous impulse, the answer is an action potential. Action potentials operate via relatively simple mechanisms. The actual potential in pacemaker cells is slightly different to that in neurons. Simply put, an action potential is the sudden fluctuation in the membrane potential. That is, the potential difference between the interior and the exterior of the cell. A resting pacemaker cell has a membrane potential of around -60 millivolts. At this point, sodium ion channels open, allowing sodium ions in and depolarizing the cell, causing cell potential to increase. -50 millivolts, voltage-controlled short-term calcium channels open to depolarize the cells enough to open the voltage-controlled long-term calcium channels at -40 millivolts. These channels stay open for longer, as the name would suggest, resulting in further complete depolarization. After this, the cell potassium ions open to allow for the outflow of potassium ions. This repolarizes the cell and restores membrane potential. When one cell depolarizes, the depolarization is spread to neighboring cells. Because when sodium ions and other positive ions move into one cell, they diffuse into neighboring cells too, triggering voltage-gated calcium channels to open. In this manner, the electrical impulse is able to travel throughout the heart. Membrane potentials of action potentials can be represented on a graph. Action potentials of the pacemaker cells themselves are slightly different to the action potentials that are generated throughout the rest of the heart. In pacemaker cells, there is no plateau and period of depolarization before repolarizing the cell, whereas there's a small plateau or delay before repolarization in the other cardiac tissue. This is important as it allows for pacemaker cells to return to a state where they can generate another action potential quickly. Now move on to discuss what goes wrong with the rhythm of the heart. Cardiac arrhythmia is a deviation from the heart's regular rhythm. This could be excessively slow, excessively fast, or irregular. To discuss further some types of cardiac arrhythmia and their symptoms, I'll now hand over to Anupam.
Heart arrhythmias can develop in multiple ways and, as such, are classified into multiple types. There are actually multiple ways of classifying them. For example, when classifying heart arrhythmias by rate, there are two main categories: tachycardia and bradycardia. Tachycardia is when the heart is beating faster than normal, which is often defined as having a resting heart rate over 100 beats per minute. Bradycardia is the opposite, a slower than normal heart rate, and is commonly determined to be under 60 beats per minute. However, that is not the only way to define heart arrhythmias. They can also be classified by their duration, whether it be a few seconds or a longer term arrhythmia, the mechanism as to how the arrhythmia occurs, or the site of origin. So let's use the site of origin as our basis of looking at these different types of heart arrhythmias. Firstly, let's look at arrhythmias of the ventricles. The ventricles are the two lower chambers of the heart, and these have arrhythmias called ventricular arrhythmias. This includes a fast, regular beating of the ventricles that may only last for a few seconds, but can also last for much longer. A few beats of ventricular tachycardia often does not cause problems. However, episodes that last for more than a few seconds can be extremely dangerous. Ventricular tachycardia can turn into other more serious arrhythmias, such as ventricular fibrillation, also known as VFib. Ventricular fibrillation occurs if disorganized electrical signals make the ventricles quiver instead of pumping normally. Without the ventricles pumping blood to the body, sudden cardiac arrest and death can occur within a few minutes due to hypoxia, usually of the brain. However, the ventricles are not the only chambers of the heart that can experience arrhythmias. The atria, the two upper chambers of the heart, can also undergo arrhythmia. The most common type of arrhythmia is atrial fibrillation, where the upper chambers of the heart start beating irregularly, and the heart can race at up to 400 beats per minute in the most extreme cases of atrial fibrillation. Atrial flutter is another type of atrial arrhythmia. In atrial flutter, the upper chambers beat to 250 to 350 times per minute. The signal that tells the upper chambers to beat is disrupted when it encounters damaged tissue such as a scar, and when the signal tries to find an alternate path, it creates a loop, causing the upper chamber to beat repeatedly. As with atrial fibrillation, atrial flutter can sometimes spread to the lower chambers of the heart as well, but not always, and as a result, this can lead to the upper chambers and the lower chambers beating at different rates, meaning the heart loses its sync, and therefore it doesn't pump blood as efficiently. Another extreme type of atrial arrhythmia is paroxysmal supraventricular tachycardia, which is basically tachycardia of the areas of the heart above the ventricles, hence supraventricular. In PSVT, electrical signals that begin in the upper chambers and travel to the lower chambers cause extra heartbeats. This arrhythmia begins and ends suddenly and can happen during vigorous physical activity such as exercise. However, it is usually not dangerous as it lasts only a very short period of time and tends to only occur in young people whose hearts are much more healthy and able to handle this sort of stress. It is not just the chambers of the heart that can undergo arrhythmias. The nodes of the heart can also undergo arrhythmias. These are known as AV blocks because the vast majority of them arise from pathology at the atrioventricular node. And these are the most common causes of bradycardia, while up until now, a lot of the cases we talked about are examples of tachycardia. Heart blocks are caused by a delay or blockage in the conduction system between the top and bottom of chambers of the heart, which is designed to allow the heartbeat to sync up together for efficient pumping of blood. However, when these connection systems are blocked, it can cause a slowed heart rate. While all these different types of arrhythmias have different mechanisms for existing and also different symptoms, the general symptoms of heart arrhythmia are pretty consistent. These include a fluttering in the chest, either a racing heartbeat in tachycardia or a slowed heartbeat in bradycardia, chest pain or angina, shortness of breath, and other slightly rarer symptoms can include fatigue, dizziness, nausea, sweating, anxiety, or in extreme cases, fainting. So now that we've talked about how arrhythmias work, the different types, and what to look out for, how do we treat these conditions? And for that, I'll hand over to Shrey.
So, with a heart arrhythmia, it's perfectly okay to lead a normal life as long as you're properly diagnosed, and that's a really important stage. Early diagnosis can really help to find solutions for heart arrhythmia. So, to diagnose heart arrhythmia, usually if you have persistent symptoms that Anupam talked about earlier, or you have a history of unexplained deaths in your family that might be due to heart arrhythmias, you're usually referred by your GP to a cardiologist. What they do is an ECG, an electrocardiogram. And what this does is in this diagnosis, what you have is sensors attached to your skin, and they used to detect the electrical signals produced by the heart when it's beating. As Adrian talked about earlier, the heart fires in certain ways, and when you have a heart arrhythmia, they're basically not firing in sync, and that's causing your atrial fibrillation or atrial flutter. And usually they'll keep this on for about more than 24 hours. So it's called a Holter monitor or sort of ambulatory ECG monitoring. And basically they just see what your heart's doing and how it's beating. And looking at the ECG trace, you have the P, Q, R, and S, and that's when the different nodes fire in the heart that Adrian was talking about earlier. And that will tell them, for example, if the spikes on the ECG trace are much closer to get together, then you'll know that that's probably tachycardia and it's just racing. Or if they're not really, you can see from the shape of them whether something is wrong. And there can also be an echocardiogram. So it's important not to get confused between an electrocardiogram and an echocardiogram. An echocardiogram is basically an ultrasound of the heart. So it uses very high frequency sound waves to basically, like sonar basically, to make an image of the heart to see what's happening there. Once you're diagnosed, there are a couple of different options for treatment, and they're mostly about preventing any adverse incidents, basically. So, in terms of drugs and medicines, beta blockers are used to slow down the heart when you're having the arrhythmia, and it's usually for tachycardia, obviously. But more common is stuff like pacemakers. So, a pacemaker is a small battery-operated device, and is implanted in the chest just under local anesthetic, keeping awake for the operation. And what it does is it produces the signals that the natural pacemaker, the sinoatrial node, isn't making because of your arrhythmia. And it basically does that for you in an artificial way. And many people have pacemakers. It's really an established treatment. Similarly, but slightly differently, is an implantable cardioverter defibrillator, also shortened to ICD. And what it does is, when you have an arrhythmia, it basically shocks the heart back into its normal rhythm. And there are 3 different stages, which is pacing, which is when it delivers a small number of shocks to just trying to get it to steady the ship. There's cardioversion, which is a bit short, sharp shocks when the heart is fibrillating more than it should, and then full defibrillation if the heart, they think the machine detects that you're in a bit of trouble and defibrillate your heart. But however, it's important to note that the ICD and the pacemaker are slightly different. The pacemaker is constantly delivering an electrical signal. It's more of a routine kind of thing, while the ICD is more for when an emergency or when your heart isn't working properly. So with an ICD, your heart still fires on its own normally, and it's just corrected by the ICD. In terms of surgery, there's catheter ablation, and it's a type of keyhole surgery. And what it does is it destroys the diseased tissue that's causing the arrhythmia in the heart. And what catheters are basically these thin, flexible tubes that they kind of put into the heart through the keyholes. And what they can do with them is pinpoint where the arrhythmia is coming from by looking at the electrical activity in the heart. And then from that, they either destroy it with heat, that's called radiofrequency ablation, or they can do it by freezing that little bit of tissue. That's called cryoablation. Catheter ablation is quite successful, over 90% success rate, which is quite good. And it can basically remove all the tissue that's causing that heart arrhythmia. Apart from all these treatments, it's also the fact that if you're diagnosed with a heart arrhythmia, it's really important that you stay safe. And that involves, for example, informing the DVLA. That's very important. If you have a problem when you're driving, that's quite dangerous. You also need to let people know, like your insurance companies and stuff like that. And usually at airports, you can have an ICD card so that the people, when you go through that security scanner, they know that you got an ICD. And with that, if you have a pacemaker and ICD, it's probably best if you don't keep stuff with strong magnets near it because it can interfere. It's thought that it could interfere with the devices. So just be on the safe side, probably stay away from them. I hope you've learned a bit more about how to treat and how to diagnose heart arrhythmias, and now I'll hand back to Adrian.
Thank you very much for listening to this week's episode of Medisodes. We covered what arrhythmias are, how the heart functions without arrhythmia, how we diagnose and treat arrhythmias, and be sure to tune in next week for another episode of Medisodes.